A car pulls up to a big old house on the outskirts of London. The doors open, and a large, friendly family gets out of the car. Everyone smiles as they look at their new home. It was unbelievable that they bought such a big house for such a low price. The occupants head inside to have a quick look around the rooms. What they didn't realize was that there was someone else in the house and that an unpleasant surprise awaited them that very night. So in the spirit of classic horror films, the Hodgson family, also known as the Enfield Poltergeists, began their grisly tale. Confronted with paranormal phenomena in 1977, they experienced daily, unwielding terror for 18 months. Objects moved and levitated on their own. Strange noises were overheard everywhere. Curtains tried to suffocate them. And one of the daughters was even possessed by a ghost. The girl fell into a trance and spoke in a voice not her own, claiming to be the ghost of a man who had died there. Seeking salvation, the Hodgsons turned to neighbors, police officers, journalists, and when all seemed unsuccessful, they learned of ghost hunters. That's how Ed and Lorraine Warren, the most famous paranormal investigators of the last century, came into their business. The couple confirmed the presence of otherworldly evil in the house and determined that Peggy's children had fallen prey to demonic possession. The Enfield Poltergeist case was an important one for the Warrens, but by no means the only one of their career. They encountered unexplained and frightening phenomena almost every day, but still couldn't imagine their lives without it. The couple lived together, without exaggeration, practically their entire lives. Lorraine met her future husband at the age of 16. Ed himself was only a year older than his sweetheart. He worked as an usher in a theater where the girl often came with her mother. The young people started dating, and they've only been apart a couple of times since. In 1945, Warren joined the Navy and was forced to leave his wife-to-be. However, 4 months later, the ship Ed was serving on sank in the North Atlantic. The young man managed to survive, and returning home, he immediately married his wife of choice. Although his military service remained Ed's principal occupation for a few more years, his true passion, the paranormal, grew stronger with each passing month. When the young man left the military and enrolled in art school, his work dealt only with one theme: houses or other places somehow associated with ghosts. Over time, Ed's interest in the supernatural world reached such a level that in his early 50s, the painting he did wasn't enough for him. The man decided to go out on his own and investigate any paranormal phenomenon that became known in the area. According to some sources, Lorraine was at first skeptical about her husband's unusual hobby, but after a while, she changed her position and even began to claim to have the power of clairvoyance. How close to reality these claims were. In 1952, the Warren family founded the first New England Society for Psychic Research. The primary purpose of the organization, which still exists today, was to investigate paranormal and demonic entities. At first, the Warrens themselves went to houses where something unexplained was rumored to be happening. Using his artistic skills, Ed sketched the building, and with the drawing in hand, the pair proceeded to visit the owners. Usually, the unexpected gift from a young artist would attract the occupants to the Warrens, and the owners would invite the explorers over themselves. Soon, word began to spread of a family of ghost hunters, helping anyone who encountered unexplained evil. After a while, people began to summon Ed and Lorraine themselves, as they were often the last hope for those who refused to be believed by the police, church, and public. Over the years, the Warrens have been involved in and witnessed some of the loudest and creepiest paranormal occurrences. Many of the events they were directly involved with inspired many world-famous horror films. For example, Lorraine and Ed hand-cast a doll, Annabelle, whose name frightens most horror film buffs. It all began in 1968 when a young nurse, Donna, was given the seemingly harmless doll. The first day after that, her flatmate started noticing all sorts of creepy disturbances. The doll seems to wander about by itself, sometimes finding strange notes in her childish handwriting, pleading for help. One night, the toy even tried to strangle one of the residents. The frightened youngster called the Warrens afterwards. The Ghostbusters claimed the spirit of a 7-year-old girl possessed the doll. Ed and Lorraine took the devilish toy and locked it in a unique glass box, placing it in their occult museum. In 2019, frightening news hit the media that Annabelle had escaped from her box and left the Warrens Museum. However, it soon came to be known that a language barrier was to blame. The translation into Chinese of an interview with actress Annabelle Wallis, who was featured in a part of the franchise, was slightly distorted, which led readers to believe the doll had escaped. Equally famous was the case of the Perron family that rocked the town of Harrisville in the early 1970s. The big old house, built in the 18th and 19th centuries, at some point began to scare its occupants. Beds were levitating, rotting, and ghosts of the 8 generations of the family who had lived there were flying between the rooms. According to one version, Ed and Lorraine, who came to the rescue, determined that the 19th century witch Bathsheba Sherman had marked the house. It was because of her curse many of the previous tenants died a horrible death, and their souls were trapped in the dwelling. The Warrens had several seances to try to subdue the spirits. During one of them, the mother suddenly began to speak in a voice that was not her own and levitated in a chair. After that incident, the Perrons declined their services. The family is not known to have moved out of the ill-fated house until 7 years later, and although they suffered many horrors in that time, none of the Perrons died, and one of their grown-up daughters even wrote a book about the events. The Warrens faced their next frightening home as early as 1975. This time, evil was waiting for them in Amityville, New York. The Lutz family approached the Warrens, a couple who had bought the house not long before, had to flee in less than a month, driven away by unexplained dark forces. When Ed and Lorraine began to investigate the story, they realized the new tenants had nothing to do with it at all. The terrible story of the house in Amityville began long before they got there. In 1974, Ronald DeFeo, a 23-year-old family resident, killed his father, mother, and 4 siblings one night. That's probably what put the otherworldly evil within the walls of the house. Reporters joined the Warrens on the case, making the story of the Amityville house quickly go viral. At trial, Ronald DeFeo refused to admit guilt, claiming that some entity residing in the house itself had forced him to do it. However, they disregarded his testimony. Years later, the Amityville case became perhaps the most successful paranormal story ever told. It formed the basis of 6 books, as many as 16 films, and numerous documentary projects. In 1981, Ed and Lorraine were once again confronted with a case in which the protagonist claimed to have been murdered under the power of otherworldly forces. Arnie Cheyenne Johnson, a young man of 19 with no motive, murdered his landlord, Alan Bono. The Warrens were already involved in the case at the time of the murder. They were working with Johnson's girlfriend's younger brother, David. The boy claimed he saw a demon and his body was being controlled by an unclean force. Ed and Lorraine decided to perform an exorcism. It is believed that the demon moved into Arnie's body during the rite, leading to the unfortunate events. The Warrens worked extensively with Johnson's lawyer and argued the devil's possession case at the trial. At the time, it was the first case of its kind in the United States. The court found no realistic version and sentenced the killer to up to 20 years in prison. After serving only 5 of those years, Arnie was released and never committed another serious crime in his life. The Warrens' other case was no less famous and started in the best tradition of horror movies. In 1986, the Snedeker family, with several children, moved into a new house in Connecticut. After a while, the new tenants began to discover items in the basement of their home that are usually only kept in mortuaries and funeral parlors. So the Snedekers realized that their home was a former funeral parlor. And all was well, but as it turned out, some of the Bureau's clients never left their final resting place. Ghosts attacked the family and their eldest son, who had schizophrenia, had his personality altered by the devil. Ed and Lorraine, summoned by the frightened tenants, confirmed that the house was haunted by evil. Quite quickly, the case hit the press, and the community was split into 2 camps. Some sincerely believed in the story of the house, while others claimed it was a fabrication and that his illness had caused the behavior of the Snedekers' elder son. Especially after the family was forced to move in, none of the house's new tenants ever encountered any paranormal evil. It may have been a mere coincidence, but a similar incident occurred in another U.S. city in the same year. In a Pittston home, a family named Smirl was attacked by evil spirits. According to the couple, there was first an unpleasant smell and then unexplained noises. But the worst thing happened later. One day, ghosts threw the Smirl's dog against the wall, and on another day, one of the couple's daughters was seriously hurt. The ghosts threw her down the stairs. When the Warren couple arrived in Pittston, they quickly determined that unclean forces were in the house. Ed claimed to have seen the dark entity with his own eyes and also found messages from the demon urging the explorers to leave. After trying almost everything, the Warren services, exorcism ceremonies from local priests, after a couple of years, the family left the cursed place. But it's worth noting that the new tenants, who moved in almost immediately, as in the case of the Snedekers, never encountered anything inexplicable or frightening. There were many more stories of otherworldly evil in the lives of Ed and Lorraine Warren. The most important artifact the demonologists collected during their research are still preserved in the Occult Museum, set up in the basement of their own house. Some people waited for them as the only salvation, while others accused them of damaging them mentally by making them believe in non-existent ghosts. Most of their stories are still very controversial today, but whatever the case, it's impossible to deny the vital role the Warrens played in the process of establishing a culture of horror and attitudes toward the unexplained. Have you encountered the paranormal? Tell us in the comments section below.